Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Mary Gallagher. I'm the Keough School of Global Affairs Dean, and this is our second Dean's Forum on Global Affairs of this semester. Thank you for joining us for this timely and important conversation. It's my pleasure to introduce Thomas J. Christensen, one of the leading scholar practitioners of Chinese foreign policy and international security. Professor Christensen is the James P. Shotwell Professor of International Relations and Director of the China in the World program at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. He also serves as the Pritzker Chair of the Center for Strategic and International Studies in DC. And prior to joining Columbia, he was the William P. Boswell Professor of World Politics at Princeton University. From 2006 to 2008, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of East Asia and Pacific Affairs in the Department of State, where he was responsible for U.S. relations with China, Taiwan, and Mongolia. His research and teaching focuses on China's foreign relations, the international relations of East Asia, and international security. Earlier in his career, he taught at Cornell University and MIT. He received his Bachelor's of Arts from Haverford College and his MA from the University of Pennsylvania and his PhD from Columbia University. And he was honored with a Distinguished Public Service Award for his U.S. Department of State public service. In addition to his contribution to public service and the government, his research and teaching have shaped how policymakers, scholars, and students understand China's role in the world, the evolving strategic landscape in East Asia, and the intersection of diplomacy, security, and great power competition. We are deeply grateful for him coming today. He's going to see his first Notre Dame football game tomorrow, which that's very important as well. After Professor Christensen gives some comments, we're going to also then invite our own Professor Joshua Eisenman to join him on the stage. Josh is a leading expert on Chinese politics, as many of you know, and foreign policy here at the Keough School. And together they will help us unpack one of the most consequential geopolitical questions of our time, how U.S. China strategic competition is reshaping stability and security across East Asia. So please join me in welcoming him. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. It's great to be back at Notre Dame. I've been here a couple times before. You're very lucky to have Mary as a leader, Mary as a China specialist. You have a great crew here with Josh and Victoria and Kyle and Kerry. It's an amazing China club you have at NDU, at Notre Dame University. And I just wanted to make a few points today about the way I viewed China's rise for decades, for over 20 years. And the occasion is an op-ed that came out yesterday by a former Princeton student of mine. He was an undergrad, Rush Doshi. And Rush went on to great things. He got a PhD at Harvard, and he became a senior official in the Biden administration. Very smart guy. And he has this op-ed about the Trump administration's approach to China on trade. And I agree with parts of it, and I disagree with other parts. And I think he's basically right that where we are now in this trade truce with China is where we were when we started the trade escalation of this year. There may be some progress on fentanyl, which is important, but we don't know if that'll actually pan out. But other than that, we're basically back to where we were. I also agree with him that China probably gained confidence in this process in a way that doesn't suit U.S. interests. In other words, the U.S. escalated and then backed off the escalation because China put counter pressure on the United States, and that will give them confidence moving forward. But I disagree with one of his big macro points in the op-ed, which is this shows that China is now as powerful as the United States. They got a chance to demonstrate this, that they're now sort of matching the United States in power. And I really disagree with that. I think the United States is still much more powerful than China, and I'll say why in a moment. But for decades, in an article I wrote in 2001, before 9/11, I wrote an article called Posing Problems Without Catching Up, in which I argued that people were obsessed with when China would close the gap entirely with the United States and become as powerful as the United States. I was already worried about China's growing power, because China that's still weaker than the United States can still spoil our whole day. And their ability to spoil our whole day gives them a lot of political leverage. And I think that that's still true. We're still much stronger than China, but China is much more powerful than it was in 2001, and China can still spoil our whole day. But I don't think we can draw the conclusion that that means that China in the military, economic, and diplomatic sphere is now a true global peer competitor of the United States. On the military front, and if we look at a map, on the military front, China cannot project much power, conventional military power, outside of East Asia. Unfortunately for us, a China that can't compete with the United States around the globe still poses huge challenges for us because East Asia really matters to the United States. And our allies and partners in East Asia really matter to the United States. And China is a really, really powerful actor in that region. Most of the places we consider fighting China or having conflicts with China are very close to China and very far from us. And that's a huge advantage that China has. In economics, China demonstrated some of the leverage it has from its place in the supply chain, and that's very real. But I don't think that makes China economically as powerful as the United States. If you just look at things like per capita GDP, if you look at things like wealth, instead of just how much money you make in a year, but how much wealth is in the United States is still much more powerful economically. The fact that the dollar is still the reserve currency around the world gives the United States tremendous power that China does not enjoy. And we still have places like Notre Dame. We still have the best higher education system in the world, and that's why people wisely come here to study. It's still the most attractive place for investment, in part because it's a dynamic economy, but also because it's a country under the rule of law and there are institutions to protect your investments. So the United States still has big advantages there. And then in the diplomatic front, and this is related to military, the United States has 60 plus allies and partners around the world that provide the United States power enhancement in any competition with China, and we are in a competition with China. China has a kind of rogues gallery of partners. It has one legal ally, North Korea, and it has two dangerous and revisionist partners in Putin's Russia and in Iran. Those countries that China partners with are not very integrated into the world economy. China is. China behaves differently than those partners. The problem for China is China always feels obliged to have their back when they cause revisionist destabilization of various regions of the world. So China gets dragged into their politics, ends up supporting them, and ends up damaging their own diplomatic portfolio with lots of other countries. So for example, China was doing extremely well in Europe before the Russian invasion of Ukraine diplomatically, especially Eastern Europe. It was doing very well. Russia invaded Ukraine, China had Russia's back, and China's reputation in Eastern Europe is very weak. So it shattered kind of years and years of buildup of diplomatic leverage there. So we are. I agree with Rush Doshi again. So I'm not criticizing this article writ large. Just that one conclusion about relative American power. I do think we're in a very fragile truce in this economic negotiation with China that could break down very easily on its own terms. The United States might become disappointed on fentanyl cooperation, the restrictions on exports of fentanyl precursors. The United States could be disappointed on how many rare earths become available to U.S. corporations moving forward. The Chinese could be disappointed on how many semiconductors, how many high-end semiconductors we allow to be sold to China, and especially the semiconductor manufacturing equipment. They might be very frustrated with us. So finally, there are unsettled areas in the agreement. That's why it's a truce. It's not really a treaty. And that is that we don't have a permanent agreement on rare earths and what China will sell us in terms of magnets. And we have things like transshipment tariffs that worry the Chinese greatly. And I can explain why later in the session, how China has moved a lot of production to third countries to sell into the United States. And the Trump administration has noticed this and has raised the prospect of transshipment tariffs against goods coming from third countries that have a lot of Chinese content. So we haven't solved that problem at all. And then that's just within the agreement. We are in a strategic competition with China. China has friends that we don't like. So the likelihood that we're going to end up in a politically tense environment with China over other issues unrelated to the initial agreement is very high. And we know that the Trump administration and President Trump's favorite tool in international politics is tariffs. If he raises tariffs over those other issues, we know one other thing is that China always punches back. So we could end up back into that escalatory situation that we were in earlier in the year. Some of those things are Russia, Ukraine. President Trump seems less and less patient with Vladimir Putin over the war in Ukraine. Iran. So Iran's military has been shattered. China has very close relations with Iran. I can imagine a situation in which China tries to rebuild the Iranian military so that the regime feels more secure, tries to do it secretly and gets caught. We know that the Iranian regime is heavily penetrated by foreign intelligence. If they get caught, will the United States raise tariffs as a punishment? If the United States raise tariffs and China punches back, then we end up back into that cycle. North Korea is always a wild card, likes to be in the newspapers every several months for doing something destabilizing. Will China have their back? Will that frustrate the United States and its allies? So you can imagine security issues getting in the way. The last thing I'll say is that, and Russia's op-ed touches upon this, but it's not a focus of it, is that there seems to be a bit of a contradiction between our military strategy in East Asia and our economic strategy in East Asia. And our military strategy in East Asia, I think very intelligently has shifted from relying on very large fixed bases in places like Japan to creating a more mobile, distributed force that's harder for Chinese strike weapons to track. That requires access within countries for our military to operate. Access within countries is very controversial domestically, and our allies and partners, not coincidentally, are often democracies. So that's a very controversial set of asks of your allies and partners. At the same time, we're pressuring them every day on economics, on tariffs, on demands for investment. And that's a potentially destabilizing mix, because if the United States becomes sufficiently unpopular in the economic sphere, it could easily become more difficult to reach those strategic goals that we have in the strategic competition with China. Finally, one of the real sources of deterrence, and I'll return to this and I'll finish with this point. I'll return to this in the conversation we have later. One of the great miracles in international politics in the 21st century is that, and it's not just the 21st century, it reaches back into the 20th century, is that East Asia, with all of its sovereignty disputes and all of its political differences and all of its different regimes, has not had an interstate war since 1979. It's really astounding if you know anything about international history. And that's been a success of U.S. policy, I think, that is the case. One of the reasons is the very thick interdependence in the region, economic interdependence in the region. And one of the reasons that China hasn't been more belligerent than it has been is that it doesn't want to create a coalition of actors that will punish it economically for its behavior. I think the American ability to get a coalition together is one of the great deterrent assets that the United States has in dealing with the rising China. But if we are upsetting the domestic politics of our allies and partners through tariffs and through other types of economic pressure, I think it makes it harder for us to coalesce a group of countries to stand up to China economically if it were to do something aggressive. And I think China will notice that over time if that continues. So I think we need to manage our allies and partners more carefully than we have, precisely because we're in a strategic competition with China, and precisely because our allies and partners are becoming more important, not less important, in that struggle. So that's where that part of Russia's piece I agree with. I'll just stop there. I've said too much probably for a short presentation. It was not short. And now we can invite Josh up, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks a lot. You want to be here or you want to be there? Okay.
All right. Welcome to the hot seat.
This is the hot seat.
Yeah, no, I'm only joking. Thank you so much for being here and for your presentation. I want to start off with a couple of questions, and then we're going to turn to some student questions.
Okay.
And hopefully, if we have time, we can turn to some audience questions as well. But I wanted to begin with a very basic question, which is if we step back and we look at the first term of the Trump administration, we look at the Biden administration, we look at the second term, how would you evaluate these three different terms? What are the similarities and differences?
Oh, okay. So it's a good question. So the first Trump term announced that we were in a strategic competition with China. This is something I wanted to touch on, so you allow me to do this. And my own view is that we had been in a strategic competition with China for a very long time. We didn't always talk about it. As a diplomat, I never felt compelled to go into a meeting with my Chinese counterparts and say, you know, we're in a strategic competition. My view is they knew we were. And if you look back, and this gets to the question that you sent to me about engagement. So there's this argument that the United States had an engagement strategy towards China for decades, and then that ended with the Trump administration. Now we're in the strategic competition phase. And my own view is that we were always strategically competing, and we've always been engaging. Even today, we're engaging. We're not totally unhooked from China. In fact, China is still one of our largest trade partners, for example, and we still have lots of diplomacy with China, just not nearly as much as we used to. But in the period in which we were trying to invite China into international institutions, trying to create economic fibers between China and the United States, and importantly between China and U.S. allies and partners, we were still concerned about the rise of the Chinese military, and we were still taking steps. So if you go to the Clinton administration in the 1990s, there was the Nye Initiative to bolster and strengthen the U.S. presence in East Asia. Through the 90s, there was the Taiwan Straits crisis of 95, 96, where we sent 2 aircraft carrier battle groups. There were arms sales to Taiwan, and there were technology restrictions. There were technology restrictions across administrations. So in the Clinton administration, it was on high-speed computers, because the idea was that was useful for mimicking nuclear testing. In the Bush administration, which I served, I can remember we wouldn't sell China precision equipment to make turbofan jet engines. There were 30-plus technologies we wouldn't sell because it had military application. So I see some of these newer measures, like restricting high-end semiconductors because they're related to AI development, and AI development is certainly related to the next generation of weapons, as of a kind. They're not fundamentally new. It's a new version of that. Maybe it's more intense now. It's more intensely, but that was in the engagement period. We were already doing that, right? We were already doing those types of things. And I do believe that if you look at the whole package, if you don't just look at the last 3 administrations, Trump 1.0, the Biden administration, Trump 2.0, the period in which the United States was explicitly saying that there was a strategic competition. You go all the way back to maybe the George H.W. Bush administration and the Tiananmen massacre, and when we stopped selling weapons to Taiwan, to the PRC. I would say that the policies that have been put in place have been a fantastic success. Mm-hmm. China has risen. There hasn't been an interstate war. China has all these sovereignty disputes, and I have maps if you want to see them, of the sovereignty disputes. And there's been no war since 1979. That was between China and Vietnam during the Cold War. It's astoundingly successful. And one of the things that bothers me is that in Washington, there's a kind of bipartisan consensus that the policies have failed. They've been problematic. They've been unsuccessful. And I was a history major in college, not a political science major. And I don't know by what historical standard you could say that record is an unsuccessful one.
Can I push you on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
Right. So you've got a situation where China has militarized the South China Sea, is engaging Taiwan in exceedingly and increasingly aggressive, has taken over full control of Hong Kong, is now in conflict and tension with Japan as of this week, right? Yeah. And is intention, even with Korea on certain claims. So could one argue that China has seized the opportunity of peace in order to establish its position throughout the region in a way which is not contested? And so this, I think people call it salami slicing tactics, have been able to take place under the cover of engagement, right?
Okay, so you listed a lot of separate things there.
Yeah.
So Hong Kong, as soon as the British said Hong Kong was going to be returned to the PRC, was in trouble, right?
Yeah.
Right. So there was not much that foreign actors could do to prevent Hong Kong from falling totally under the control of Beijing if it wanted to have total control over it. And the big question was, would it want to, right?
And it wants to.
And it wants to, so it's done. The South China Sea is very complicated. You say militarized. So they've built artificial islands with military infrastructure on them.
Yeah.
They haven't used the Chinese military against any of the other disputants since 1988. They use Coast Guard. They use what's called the maritime militia to assert administrative authority, to put coercive pressure on. It's very it's very upsetting to the other disputants. It's very potentially destabilizing. But the U.S. is still there. They don't challenge the U.S. military militarily in the region. Taiwan. So Taiwan is under a tremendous amount of military coercion from the PRC. Taiwan is still there. So Taiwan, U.S. switched recognition in 1979 from the Republic of China, which is capital in Taipei. I lost the map. And to the PRC. And it's been under pressure, particularly in the post-Cold War era, from China throughout. U.S. policy has been to bolster the Taiwan military, tell the PRC that the United States cares a lot about Taiwan's security, maintain a very strong military presence in the region, and Taiwan has not been attacked. PRC's had the ability to attack Taiwan for quite a long time. It hasn't been attacked. Now, would it be better if it wasn't being coerced all the time? Sure. Would it be better that various actors handled that situation with consistency and not waffled back and forth in the way we talk about Taiwan and deal with Taiwan? Would Taiwan be in a better place? I think so. Would it be better if Taiwan politicians maintained a moderate stance towards the mainland even as they strengthen themselves against the threat that poses them? Yes, I do think that would be true. So is that policy a failure? I mean, Taiwan's a miracle. Taiwan is a tremendous miracle. South Korea is under a lot of pressure from China, but South Korea is a sovereign state. It's been protected from attack from North Korea. Its economy is a miracle. So I consider these things a great success. And one of the reasons all of these things happen is the United States has maintained a very strong military position in East Asia. So it's not all about engagement. The problem in the public debate is that people say, oh, there's the engagement period of U.S. China policy. That meant the United States was nice. And now there's a strategic competition phase of U.S. foreign policy. Now the U.S. is tough. It's not that simple.
Yeah.
It's just not that simple.
Let me keep you on the Taiwan issue. So we had something called strategic ambiguity, where we were ambiguous about how we would respond.
We still have
to it. During the Biden administration, the president said on 4 separate occasions that he would come to the defense of Taiwan.
Yeah.
And just this week, we've heard the Japanese prime minister's comments,
Yeah.
where she voiced a willingness to be supportive of Taiwan in the case that it was coerced, surrounded, or threatened by China. What should, and of course the Trump administration has walked back from declaratively stating that we would defend Taiwan. So what is the right U.S. policy in the Taiwan Strait? What should we be doing given what's happened over the last?
It's a great question, Josh,
few years?
and this is a perfect example of how our policy has worked.
Yeah.
Right? The traditional one China policy, which is quite complicated, right? It has a lot of different moving parts. Part of it is this idea of strategic ambiguity, that the United States doesn't treat Taiwan like a treaty ally to which it will always come to the defense no matter what, but it constantly expresses grave concern about Taiwan's security and the very real threats that the PRC poses to Taiwan's security. And that should happen all the time. And it's under law, the Taiwan Relations Act, that the United States needs to do 2 things. One is supply arms of a defensive nature to Taiwan so that it has some defensive wherewithal itself. And the president needs to maintain a strong U.S. military presence in East Asia so that the president would have serious options if the president were so choose to intervene. Now, I'm a political scientist, even though I was a history major in college, and I look at Thomas Schelling. And Thomas Schelling talks about deterrence. How do you deter? And he says you have to have a credible threat of punishment or intervention, that you can get in there and do some damage as part of a deterrent threat. And you have to have a credible assurance attached to that, to the target, saying, if you don't misbehave, if you don't act aggressively, you will not be punished. Your interests won't be taken away. Mm-hmm. And the strategic ambiguity piece of the One China policy fit both of those. And this is why. People worry that there isn't enough credible threat in strategic ambiguity. So they think, we need to have a clear commitment. You need to have the president say, we will defend Taiwan under all circumstances. Otherwise, the PRC won't take us seriously and they will attack. The problem with that argument is I study the Chinese military, I study the Chinese leadership of thinking about Taiwan on a regular basis. I did when I was in the government. It was in my area of responsibility. I was the official in the State Department who had this portfolio. I never got the impression that the Chinese military or the Chinese civilian leadership underestimated the prospect of U.S. intervention if they attack Taiwan. They expect U.S. intervention. So there's no need to change that piece of the strategic ambiguity equation to bolster the credible threat. What you do by doing is that you look like you're restoring the alliance with Taiwan. And if you restore the alliance with Taiwan, you undercut the assurances to the PRC that if you don't use force, we're not going to harm you. Because restoring official relations with Taiwan or restoring the alliance with Taiwan would be to undercut the entire agreement that we had when we shifted diplomatic relations and we're much more likely to cause a conflict than to deter one. So even when President Biden 4 times said that, his more experienced State Department and National Security Council people immediately said, there's been no change in our policy. Right? Why did they do that? And one of his statements went beyond just saying, I will defend Taiwan. It said, Taiwan is a NATO-like ally. I mean, that's just factually inaccurate. He just wasn't on his script, right? So I don't think it's useful to do that. I don't think it's useful for the United States to signal that the reason that we have military forces in the region, the reason we sell weapons to Taiwan, is that we're moving in the direction of recognizing Taiwan as a sovereign state or restoring the alliance, because I think that will cause a conflict. And I do a lot of work with the military in the United States, and I can say one thing about our military capabilities in the region, which are real and significant. We cannot do anything to protect Taiwan from severe harm in a war. So the biggest victim of an otherwise avoidable war across the Taiwan Strait will be Taiwan. Everyone else will suffer too. And it could escalate into something truly horrific. But it's not as if the U.S. military power can be used to protect Taiwan from harm. And I've said many times that most Americans, almost all Americans love Taiwan. Some Americans want to love Taiwan to death.
Building on this question about the military, there's been a recent spate of purges in the PLA, up to the highest levels. I think things that haven't happened since, Lin Biao was taken down. I mean, it's been that long since we've seen this level of purges. And of course, this is part of a longer-term assessment to kind of purify the party and purify the military by Xi Jinping. What do you think's going on here? Can you read some tea leaves for us quickly? And feel free to punt on this one if you don't feel you can. But I figured having studied the military, you might have assessment.
No, I think it's very significant. But there's been a lot of purges in the civilian sector too. So people focus on the military, especially they focus on the military generals that Xi Jinping himself has hired. And it's kind of stunning how many of those have been fired subsequent, because he's been in power a long time now. But a lot of civilians have been fired as well. When Xi Jinping came into power, he said publicly that if the Chinese Communist Party doesn't clean up corruption, it's going down. It's kind of extraordinary for an authoritarian leader to say that. So I think he's actually sincerely focused on the problem of corruption. The PLA is famously corrupt. for almost generations, going back in the reform era. To get promoted in the military, you had to pay your superior officer. It wasn't a question of merit. It wasn't a question of skill. It was a question of how much money you could get together. So it was hurting military power. The bad news is Xi Jinping's very serious about creating military power for China, right? And he's trying to get this culture to actually think about war fighting, not thinking about how to get individually wealthy. The problem is if the whole system is corrupt, if the whole party is corrupt, or the whole military is corrupt, any anti-corruption campaign by nature, by its essence, is political. Because you can't fire everyone. So if you're firing only a subsection, how do you decide where to apply the prosecution? And it becomes a political prosecution for some reason or another. But it doesn't mean that those people who are being prosecuted weren't guilty of corruption. The good news from a U.S. perspective is that China has various military options in places like Taiwan, against places like Taiwan. Some of them are more complicated than others. Amphibious invasion of Taiwan is a very complex operation. It would be very risky. And if Xi Jinping doesn't trust his military leaders, not because they're going to launch a coup against him, but because he doesn't think they're actually good at fighting, because they've been too busy bribing each other all these years, it makes him less likely to order, all things being equal, less likely to order a complex military operation. The bad news, from a U.S. perspective, is there are things that the PRC can do against Taiwan that don't require things that they're not very practiced at. And when Speaker Pelosi went to Taiwan, which I think was very ill-advised, the Chinese military got the opportunity to practice some of those things in real time, in a joint way, around Taiwan. And I do have a map. I'll show you the map. I do have a map to get through my graphs. There it is. So that's what happened after Speaker Pelosi visited Taiwan. And the pressure on Taiwan that you very justifiably raise has not gone away since then, the very real pressure, military pressure. That looks like a blockade. And a blockade is something they're good at. Now they've gotten a chance to practice it in real space and time. And a blockade, frankly, is something we can't do anything about. We can respond to it. We can punish China in response. But we can't open up Taiwan ports for regular commercial traffic if the PRC wants to shut it down. And Taiwan is very trade dependent. It'd be devastating for the whole world, including for the Chinese economy if they were to do it. But there's not much we can do about that. And the reason the Speaker Pelosi's trip was, I think, ill-advised is it did nothing to make Taiwan stronger to stand up to the PRC. And it provided the PRC the opportunity to do this exercise and with third countries blame the United States for it. Rather successfully. Places like Tokyo, Seoul, right? They were able to say, this isn't a provocative action that we're doing. If they did this on a clear blue day, it would blow up everything.
So do you expect they'll do the same now that the Japanese Prime Minister has made statements? Will they utilize this as an opportunity?
The Japanese Prime Minister's statements, I think, also would fall into this category. The statement, because it was an interview like this. The statement
was in a parliament she made the statement.
She was asked questions, right? So it was kind of a back and forth. So the statement was more complicated than it's been boiled down in the press, as was often the case. But it's not, again, I don't think it's necessary for Japan to say, if the PRC attacks Taiwan, we will fight. They need to develop the capabilities to fight. They need to coordinate with the United States, and it's good that Japan in 2015 adopted collective self-defense, which means they can fight offshore if their allies and friends are in trouble. That's all good, that's all positive. But there's no need for them to say, we will definitely fight in those circumstances. And they could maintain the kind of position the United States does by saying, we really care about peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait because it affects our security. And it does.
I think that's more or less what she said.
But she went a little bit further, as my understanding. She went a little bit further. And the problem is, those types of things are easy to correct. So you see, in the case of the Biden administration, first 2 years of the Biden administration, he made these 4 statements. Didn't make them in the second 2 years. And The discipline and how we talked about the one China policy, which is complicated, got much better in the second 2 years, in my opinion. I've said this in print, so I can say it here. And I think that the Japanese posture on Taiwan in recent years has also been very positive, which is to say, we really care about this. Don't think that we don't care about it. Don't think that regional security doesn't affect our security. That's fine. She did say that, right? But she also implied, and we're in. Now, you don't have to say we're in, right? Because that triggers this negative reaction, political reaction, which is not just predictable, it's predicted, and it happens every time, and it's not particularly helpful. But here's the problem. When I was in the government, we criticized the Taiwan government for an initiative to join the UN under the name Taiwan, which we saw as a revision of the status quo in cross-strait relations, and we saw as potentially damaging if it were to pass. We criticized that. It was very controversial to get that through the U.S. government. And I made a speech on September 11th, 2007. I remember the date because it was September 11th, so it's a dramatic date, right? So I remember the date. And it was interagency cleared. But it was difficult to get that through the interagency process. They were going to criticize the leadership in Taiwan for pursuing this type of initiative that we saw as destabilizing and risky for Taiwan, right? Very difficult to do that today with all this military stuff around Taiwan, to criticize what the Taiwan leadership's doing, because it looks like you're justifying all the pressure. There wasn't all that pressure back then.
So it sounds like you're advocating for a walk softly but carry a big stick approach, right?
Yeah.
But you still have to reinforce
so the name of that
the
speech
Philippines, et cetera, right?
Yeah. So the name of that speech was a strong and moderate Taiwan.
Okay.
And what it is pure shelling. Strong, credible threat. Moderate, credible assurances. So I really believe in that. The problem now is when someone like Prime Minister Takaichi says comments like this, traditionally governments can kind of walk them back, right? And say, well, you're misreading it. But the Chinese consul general said he wanted to chop her head off, right? That makes it almost impossible in a democracy to retract something. In this case, very difficult for the United States to publicly criticize the Taiwan government when it's surrounded by PRC forces. So the PRC makes it harder for its potential adversaries and opponents to behave moderately by being as coercive as it does. So I think that's not in China's interest, but that's how they roll, and that's where we are. But I still think strategic ambiguity makes sense. Clarifying the commitment would be dangerous. It would be dangerous for us. It would be dangerous for Taiwan. It would be dangerous for the PRC. And I don't think it's a giant zero-sum game now.
Let me pull a U-turn here and change the subject on us, and then I'm going to go to the student questions. But I do have one question that I think is very relevant for Columbia. It's very relevant here at Notre Dame and other universities, which is how should we be looking at Chinese students coming to our university? Us and other universities have received pressure not to take Chinese students who have China Scholarship Council funding.
Yeah.
Is this something that we should be concerned about? Is this a red herring? How should we basically work through this particular issue, seeing as though Chinese students have been such an important part of our educational communities at American universities for so long?
I think it's great that Chinese students study here. Are there problems attendant to that fact? Sure.
Is the CSC a problem? Is this something you're
I don't want to comment on the CSC, but there are various government programs that make me nervous. Chinese government programs that make me nervous because they have a lot of postdoctoral fellowships. The problem with it is you get these emails and they say, I have a Chinese government scholarship and I want a postdoctoral position at your university and all my expenses are paid. So it looks kind of attractive, right? But that's not how postdoctoral fellowships are supposed to work. They're supposed to be competitive on merit. So what worries me about anybody who says, I have a government subsidized, is how did they get it? What was the competitive process by which they got it? Did they get it for political reasons or did they get it for merit reasons? If it's not transparent, it makes me nervous. But I'm not going to criticize any particular program in China. But I run a postdoctoral program. I never simply accept someone from China because they have money. And I could use free fellows in the program, right? It would be very useful financially. I say, it's great that you have this money from the Chinese government. Send your application in. If you win the competitive application competition with the other applicants, great that you can come for free. But first you have to win the competition. I can't simply accept you because you have money, whether it's your grandfather's money or whether it's Mao Zedong's money. I can't accept you simply because you have money. So I think that's one way to deal with it. And then there's a broader question. Are there spies? There are 270,000 Chinese students in America. Of course there are some spies in there. Of course there are. Of course, right? And then there's a bigger problem, and Mary knows this. China in 2017 passed a law that said every citizen of China must be willing to spy. It's called the espionage law. That doesn't mean every Chinese student in America is a spy, but it means you have to be somewhat suspect about what they might be doing because they're kind of required to do it if they're asked. So that's a problem. But I don't worry about it that much. Like I have security clearances. I do work for the U.S. government. The solution to that is don't tell people who don't have security clearances secrets. Right? It's how you treat them like a spy. You're not a spy, I don't think. But I wouldn't tell you something classified.
I don't want to know.
So just keep it to yourself. Yeah, keep it to yourself. The problem is that some Chinese citizens in the States do things that are not consistent with their visas, and they could be an English major, and they could be hanging around a technology lab or something like that. But there are measures for that. I worked at MIT for 5 years, as you said, as Mary graciously said in her nice introduction of me. And it was a great experience. But MIT does a lot of weapons research. But they have this separate section of the campus called Lincoln Labs. It's not on the main campus, it's out in the suburbs. And they do the classified work there, and you have to have clearances, and you have to be a citizen of the United States or an allied country to work there. And they keep it separate. So that's a kind of simple solution. It gets more complicated in certain fields, like lasers and other things that have military applications. And it gets back to that issue of export controls, which I think are appropriate. There's certain things, we have traditionally wished the Chinese economy well. The big misperception in China is that the United States has consistently wanted the Chinese economy to tank and for there to be instability there. We have consistently wished the Chinese economy well, but we haven't wished the Chinese military modernization well. We don't want the PLA to grow faster. So we've always had these technology restrictions. They're appropriate. I personally believe this high-end semiconductor restrictions that the Biden administration put in place are appropriate. Mm-hmm. I worry that they might be lifted, actually. We don't wish the Chinese military to grow faster than it otherwise would because of our inputs, and that's appropriate. But this idea that we're just trying to damage the Chinese economy all the time is another, but they have to draw these balances. It's great that 270,000 Chinese citizens get to see America. I wish more Americans would go to see China. The big drop has not been in Chinese students in America. The big drop has been in American students in China, and I was one. And I think it's a great experience. And I think even if you don't like the place, even if the place worries you, understand it. Ignorance is rarely a strategic asset.
So maybe we can turn to some student questions right now. I've been looking out. I don't see, is Maeva here? Is Maeva here? Okay, I don't see her, but why don't I do this? I'll read her question, and then we can turn to Cheney, and Cheney can ask her question. So, Maeva asks, given China's expanding sphere of influence, do you believe a turn toward U.S. isolationism undermines American strategic interests in East Asia? In other words, how costly is retrenchment when Beijing is actively deepening its regional footprint? And would you mind if Cheney asked hers and you could take them? Is that all right?
Yeah, sure.
We could take two at a time since we're...
if I can handle it.
If you can handle it.
My question was, what do you think is the most misunderstood aspect of China's strategy in East Asia from a U.S. perspective, and what has caused this confusion?
Oh, okay. So what's okay. So let me start with the first question. Yes, I am, as I suggested in my opening comments, I think that U.S. allies and partners, the U.S. presence in East Asia has been a big part of the equation that's kept the peace in that region, and that region really matters to us. And war is really terrible, right? That doesn't mean you just unilaterally disarm and pull out of there. So war is really terrible, so deter it. And the best way to deter it is to have a strong presence in East Asia. And it worries me on the military front, when we have trouble with our allies, either over economics or burden sharing, and I give the Trump administration high grades on one score, which is they came into office in 2017 in the first term, and again in this year, saying that our allies and partners should contribute more to the joint effort of deterring around the world. And the allies have responded. I sometimes worry they've responded because they no longer trust the United States to help them, which is not the right reason to do it, right? But I think that is a factor, unfortunately. But they have gotten them to do more than they have done in the past, and I give them credit for that. It's not easy to do that. We've always been asking them to do more, and it's not easy to get there, so I give them credit for that. But a strong U.S. presence is really essential. Them doing more doesn't replace the U.S. role and in the military sphere. But where I really think we've been absent, and this isn't just the Trump administration, it was the Biden administration, and it was a bipartisan consensus, and that's in international economic agreements. They've gone forward. There are international economic agreements in Asia. The TPP, which we pulled out of in 2017 unilaterally, was opposed by candidate Clinton in the 2016 campaign as well. Everybody was against it. We pulled out of it unilaterally. It went forward without us. And now China wants to get into it. There's a big international trade agreement in the region. You're aware of this, RCEP. We're just not there. We're basically absent at the WTO. We're absent in all these multilateral, and China's there. How is that to our advantage? But the problem is multilateralism has a bad name in the United States. Somehow we're a victim of it. I don't really see why people have that attitude. But yeah, I think that's an own goal. At the same time, we've been fortunate. We pulled out of all these things. We pulled out of the climate agreements. We pulled out of the agreement unilaterally on Iran that we formed with 5 other countries. And you would think that China would move into that diplomatic space and look really good. But China has a tendency to shoot itself in the foot diplomatically, as we saw in the case of Prime Minister Takaichi's rather forward statements about Taiwan, and a Chinese consul general says, "I'll chop her head off." That's not very successful diplomacy.
Is wolf warrior diplomacy back then? Is this?
No, it's not back. I mean, it's always been there to some degree. It's not back as a big stream. But China has alienated. I was in Korea a few weeks ago. China, there's a huge divide in Korean politics. There's a consensus that China is a problem in Korean politics across the spectrum, and that's just really bad diplomacy. China's been bullying Korea, since the Obama administration was in office in the United States, and it backfires. So China hasn't really always cashed in the way that the question implies, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be competing better than we are by being present and being engaged. In terms of misperceptions, one of the misperceptions. So this is it's going to sound really geeky because I'm a geek. Right? So one of the big misperceptions that Americans have is that China has expanding territorial claims. You'll hear it in Congress all the time. China has expanding territorial claims. And I was asked once when I was testifying in Congress, does China have expanding territorial claims? And I said, no, I wish they did. And the person was shocked. And I said, the problem is China has expansive territorial claims. And I can show you the territorial. One of them is Taiwan, but it's an old claim. Another is in the East China Sea, what the Japanese call the Senkaku Islands, and what the Chinese call the Diaoyu Islands. And the other is this giant one in the South China Sea, this red line, which basically claims everything inside that red line. That's a 9-dash line.
Didn't they add another dash to it recently,
Yeah,
though?
but it doesn't make it bigger. It's another dash.
Okay.
I don't know. There was 11 once, and then there was 9. Now there's 10. So the problem is these are old claims. And the reason I say that's a problem is they really believe this stuff is theirs. And if they didn't really believe this stuff was theirs, it would be much easier to deter them from expanding their power into those regions. But this is an old Chinese nationalist trope that Taiwan is part of China, that the South China Sea is Chinese, and that the Diaoyu Islands are Chinese. There are no Japanese Senkaku Islands. And they were taken away in 1895 in a war, and they need to be returned. The Japanese story is very different. Right? And the problem in the region, and what makes East Asia potentially more volatile than say, Europe during the second half of the Cold War, is that nobody agrees. You see this 9-dash line? You see all the other colors? Those are all the claims of the other disputants. All of those disputants really believe their claims are legitimate. And there's this, social science. The term social science is used all the time. It's often not appropriate, right? But there is some real science in social science. And one example of it is something done by a Nobel Prize winning colleague of mine who passed away recently at Princeton, Daniel Kahneman. Tversky and Kahneman's prospect theory, tested in laboratories. That's why it's science, right? And they show that people will take bigger risks and pay higher costs to defend what they believe is legitimately theirs than they will be to get new stuff. And the problem in East Asia is there's no clear sense of where the actual legitimate status quo lines are, and everybody believes that their claims are legitimate. That's really potentially fragile.
Even Brunei, because that's kind of funny looking.
Brunei, yeah, it's rectangular because it's an EEZ. These are EEZs, right? So there's a claim, and then that's not an EEZ. That's an actual claim.
That's a claim.
That's a claim. It's not an EEZ. I correct myself. But Brunei, Malaysia, what Brunei's connected to, has its own claim. So this green one is the Malaysian claim because there's two parts of Malaysia, right? And this purple one is very expansive. That's Vietnam. Very expansive. And the Vietnamese really believe this, right? They hate the 9-dash line. And the Chinese say, but we had it in the 1930s. We have it in the Constitution of the Republic of China, Chiang Kai-shek's China, right? We have this claim. It's always been there. And the Vietnamese say, we were a French colony then. We didn't have any say in that map. You can't just take our whole coastline. Right? So everybody believes they're in the right. That's a very volatile situation. So I think that's the one I would focus on, is that Americans believe that these claims are new and that somehow you can stop them from making new claims. Maybe they'll start to make new claims if they use military force to solve all these things, and they'll get more greedy. I worry about that. That's why I don't want to let them simply use military force to solve all their claims. But I think that's a big misperception. The long answer to a very good question.
Yeah, great. So a couple of more questions here. One of them is going to be from Jennifer, and the next one is going to be from Maggie Matfee, right next to you. So these two right there, and in any order is fine. So. Yeah.
Hello, okay. So my question is, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how developing technologies, including AI and or semiconductors, will influence power dynamics in East Asia within the next decade or so.
You brought your crystal ball, right?
Yeah, I know. No, not only do not have a crystal ball, I taught at MIT. I didn't study there, So,
but the geopolitics.
Yeah, I get it.
And we have one more here from Maggie.
So I'll take two. Sorry. Go ahead.
My question's a little different, but it's about, given the suppression of the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, what do you see for the future of Hong Kong in the context of its role in China and the rest of the world, and how has Hong Kong's new leadership affected the U.S. and China's relationship?
We should say that Maggie has lived in Hong Kong, so she
Yeah,
has lived
I
experiences.
met her at lunch. It was a great experience. And AI. So I study a lot of international security politics, and AI is going to be very important for a range of military applications, including autonomous weapons, including C4ISR, the ability to see the battlefields, know where your adversary is, know where you are, and maybe prevent them from having the same capabilities. Things like tracking weapon systems that are hard to find, like submarines. I think it's going to be important there. And the U.S.'s greatest advantage in the military sphere are submarines. So that worries me. I think It has other applications that are spooky. And I think it is the cutting edge technology where the competition is going on. I think China does very, very well in innovating with the hardware capabilities that they have, which are far behind the U.S. capabilities, but they seem to be able to use less impressive hardware to do impressive things, which I think maybe 20, 25 years ago people would have been surprised by. Because the rap back then was that China were copiers. They were really good at copying other people's innovative technologies. They weren't that good at innovating. And I think they are actually getting better at innovating. And one of the ways they're innovating, they're kind of innovating by necessity, because they're unable to get some of the things they want to get in terms of the hardware. So they're working around that with lesser technologies. It's impressive. I worry about AI everywhere, but I'm kind of backwards that way. I worry about it in the classroom. I worry about it in society. I worry about surveillance technologies, not just in the hands of authoritarian regimes, but especially in the hands of authoritarian regimes. And AI is going to enable that. I'm a corny, old-fashioned American who believes in the spread of democracy as a universal value, not an American mission.
In the neoliberal or the neoconservative sense? Do you spread it by sending professors like us around, or by the point of a gun? How to spread that democracy?
Well, if you're doing it militarily, don't send professors.
Well, not us anyway, right? Yeah.
I don't think it generally works at the barrel of a gun. Could it be justified by the barrel of a gun? I could imagine circumstances where it could
Venezuela.
be. Venezuela? I mean, are we going to create democracy in Venezuela that way? I don't know.
Sorry, we're a bit off topic on
Yeah,
that.
no, I'm not a Venezuela expert. I don't know. But I believe in the spread of democracy. I think there are bad ways to do it and good ways to do it, but I believe it should be a principle of U.S. foreign policy. It's not a principle of U.S. foreign policy right now, so this is an exceptional time. And I believe that surveillance technologies with AI capabilities make it harder for people to throw off the yoke of an authoritarian government. And I think countries like China export that technology not because they want to stop color revolutions necessarily, which they do want to stop, but because they're really good at it and they'll sell it to anyone. And I don't particularly like it in democracies. I find it a little creepy that governments can watch everything you do. I'm old-fashioned. But I do believe in the spread of democracy, and I do think that these technologies will make it harder, not easier, to spread democracy in the future. And again, I don't say spread democracy because I want America to dominate the world. Democracy is not an American intellectual property right. It's just a good idea. And I think we allow authoritarian regimes to use the excuse of standing up to the United States to oppose democracy, and we shouldn't. And I was in a human rights dialogue in China in 2008, spring of 2008. We hadn't had one in 6 years. And I think we did the right thing in that dialogue, which is the Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and Labor, Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, opened the dialogue with a 20-minute expose on U.S. violations of human rights, starting with slavery, Jim Crow, women not being able to vote, genocide against Native Americans. And then he finished his statement and said, I'm just driving home to you that human rights are a universal concept, not an American concept. Now let's talk about your problems. And I think that's probably the best approach to it. And I think that
What was their response?
they were dumbfounded.
Yeah. Well, they didn't open the
Visibly-
books and say, well, let me tell
They
you.
didn't
about
expect us to do something like this. They're used to Americans saying, "You stink, we're great," right? Right? And I thought it was did we empty the political prisons? No. Right? But I think it's the right approach, and it should be a universal concept. And it's not a coincidence that Xi Jinping, when he speaks to his underlings, and this relates to Hong Kong, is that he calls democracy a Western value. So what does that do? It's a Western value. That means it doesn't apply to us because we're Chinese.
It's othering it.
And it's also a conspiracy of American power. The last thing I'll say about democracy, and this is related to Hong Kong as well, is when the United States diplomats, and I did it, asked for political reform in China and said, this will help you solve your problems. You have a corruption problem, like Xi Jinping said, then get independent courts, get investigative journalists, have a free press. Those are the kinds of solutions, not give all power to one person and have them fire a bunch of generals and because everything's coming together here. Right? So that's not the solution. And a lot of Chinese nationalists see that as a Trojan horse designed to destabilize China and make it weaker. But from a proper U.S. perspective, you're actually wishing China well when you're asking them to go through political reform. That will make China stronger, more stable, and more respected on the international stage.
But it may not make the party more stronger.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't necessarily make the party stronger. Yeah. And that's why there is a difference between the Chinese Communist Party's interests and the nation's interests. They don't match, even though Chinese public statements, Chinese political statements, always equate the two.
Yeah.
They always equate the two. And in Hong Kong makes me very sad. But as an international security analyst, I always knew that Hong Kong had as much freedom as Beijing allowed it to have. That Beijing had all the levers over Hong Kong. It chose, for various reasons, to leave Hong Kong basically alone for quite a long time. But it didn't need to invade Hong Kong. It could shut off the water to Hong Kong. It could shut off the electricity to Hong Kong. It has all the levers. And the democracy movement was a threat to what Josh said. It was a threat to single-party rule in China, by example, and they cracked down upon it. I actually think the crackdown on it probably was delayed by COVID. Probably would have happened sooner. I think the one thing that surprised me about the crackdown is how long it took for them to crack down on it. And it's very sad. I really liked Hong Kong in the old days. When I was first at Peking University in 1990, it was right after Tiananmen Massacre, and China was so repressive. And I went to Hong Kong, and it felt free. It felt like I could say what I wanted. Of course, it was under British control then.
Yeah.
But one of the things about British control. So one of the things about Hong Kong that is true when Chinese nationalists talk about it is that the British didn't give them self-rule and democracy, right? Until they left, they wanted it, right? So that's one of the problems with Hong Kong's history is that it has never really had its own self-rule and democracy, but it had really great institutions that had been compromised. And one of them is the rule of law, which I mentioned a moment ago. Hong Kong was famous for having independent courts that really followed the rule of law, and it had a very vibrant free media. And both of those things have been compromised, and that's very sad. So Hong Kong had a lot to lose. It had a lot to gain through pro-democracy protests. It had a lot to lose, too. And sadly, it lost a lot and didn't gain all that much.
Well, on that sad but nostalgic note, I think we are at the end of time. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Josh.
For answering the questions.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for coming. Now,